I'm a listener, so
Welcome. As you can see, it's a small group this morning, but I hope you'll find the lesson interesting and that you'll be with us. And thank you for those of you who comment or say you enjoy the class. It's helpful. So with that, I'm going to make the bracha and we'll start the screen share. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
mhm.
I have it. This is it. Okay. Go into the place, and here we are. Right. So we started, of course, this parsha with the idea of the sabbatical and jubilee years, and then that had major implications for how land was to be sold, that essentially was not in perpetuity. The idea of being able to redeem a land after it had been sold, and the whole idea of ownership comes up, of course, as a result of this. And then we start to get, yesterday we began passages that involve equity, issues of equity, and how one treats people who are disadvantaged and trying to give them a break. So here we go. V'chi yamuch achicha imach v'nimkar lach. So this is your brother, literally, becomes poor. In other words, they are in straits with you, v'nimkar lach, and he is sold to you. Lo ta'avod bo avodat aved. You shall not cause him to serve as a slave, as a servant. And here we are on the Rashi on this. Avodat aved. What do we mean by the kind of service of a slave? Avodah shel gnai, meaning something that's the kind of service, the kind of work that is somewhat humiliating, that causes humiliation to a person who's doing it. Specifically, sheyehe nikarba ke'eved, that people should see and be able to recognize that he is a slave. Shelo yolich kelav acharav. So, for example, we don't want him to be carrying your clothes, his clothes, after him, the Veit HaMerchatz, to the bathhouse. Velo yin'ol lo min alav, nor should he be tying his shoes. Those are not the kind of work that you should ask a person in this particular situation to be serving you. On the other hand, we've had the negative, kasachir, like a hired laborer. Ketoshav, and a toshav is very often translated as a resident alien. In other words, someone who is not necessarily of the part of that society, but has come to remain there, to settle there, or a settler perhaps. Ye'imach, he shall be with you. So possibly we could translate Toshav as a settler. And in fact, I'm going to put that in here as a translation. Oops, sorry. Ad shnat hayovel yavod imach, until the Jubilee year, he shall serve you. He shall work with you, literally. So let's take a look at Rashi. Let's see if he starts here. Just double check. There we go. Kesachir, right. Like a hired laborer, ketoshav. And again, we're translating it as settler. Rashi is going to try and help us understand what the Hebrew means here. Avodat karka. So either we're talking about field labor, umalechet omanut, or the type of work involving a craft. Kisha'ar sachirim hitnaheg bo, like other hired laborers, you should deal with him. You should treat him as a hired laborer. Achnat Hayovel, until the Jubilee year, to the extent that impaga bo yovel, that if in fact the Jubilee year occurs lifnei sheshanim, before 6 years are up, hayovel motzio, he goes out in the Jubilee year, even if it's earlier. Now, we didn't read here under what circumstances this person is becoming a servant. And I'm wondering to myself, because there is a situation where someone who commits a crime, like so for example, theft or some kind of larceny, and is unable to pay back the amount and the fine, that the court has a right to sell him for his work so that he can pay back the person he wronged. And I'm wondering if that's the situation that it's talking about. This is mentioned initially back in the book of Exodus in Parshat Mishpatim. It's the Parsha that follows Yitro, which is where we read the Ten Commandments. The Parsha that follows that discusses this particular situation where a court is selling an individual to pay for their crime, and talks about how they are to be released in the 7th year. So that's why, although I don't believe Rashi stated it, I believe that's the situation where we're talking about Yamuch Achicha that we read. So interesting next statement. V'yatsa mi'emach. So in other words, when the year of release comes, he shall leave you, hu uvanav imor, he and his children, literally his sons, with him, which of course raises a question that Rashi is going to immediately ask. V'shav el mishpachto, he shall return to his family, ve'el achuzat avotav yashuv, and to the holding of his ancestors he shall go back. So this was, of course, at this time, primarily an agricultural society, the connection of people to their ancestral holdings. We know that that was part of the whole notion of dividing up the land of Israel amongst the tribes, and that each tribe had their own specific area of land, and then each family within each tribe had that as well. And I think to this day, of course, we have this sense that when you actually own real estate, or at least, of course, when we use that term own, we have to have a certain parenthetical or in inverted commas, what we mean by that. But nevertheless, that if having that attachment to real estate is, of course, lends itself to a certain level of security, and a place that you have a place that you're attached to. So this is the idea that there's some part of this equity that we're talking about, is that people who have, are able to return to that original situation where they have property. So let's take a look at the Rashi on this. So the question, hu ovanav imo, he and his children with him. Amar Rabbi Shimon, said Rabbi Shimon, imhu nimkar, if this person was sold, banav, his children, mi mochran, since when did they get sold? Right? It says you should release him and his family. So they weren't sold. And if we in fact are talking about someone who was sold because they had stolen something, the children didn't steal anything. The court had no right to sell them. Elamikan. But the truth is that from this statement we can infer Sherabo Chayav Bimzonot Panav, that in fact his master is obligated to provide food for his children, in other words, to support his family as well. That's part of the deal. Ve'lachuzot avotav, and to the holding of his, or the inheritance of his fathers, his ancestors. and this is in the Sifra and also in the Talmud. El kavod avotav. Okay, so in other words, understood, when it talks about the inheritance, it's talking about the honor of his ancestors, meaning ve'ein lezalzalo b'chach. He should not be made to feel humiliated that at this point he's able to return to their holdings. And achuzah, which generally has to do with a part of a field, for example, etc. Cheskat means the status in this particular case. The status of, in other words, his former status should be fully returned to him. He should be able to regain his former status, should not be held. This whole incident shouldn't be held against him. And there is, again, these are very interesting statements here in Leviticus about the treatment of people. Ki avadaihem, because in fact, they are my servants. God is saying, they are my servants. In other words, clearly all the Jewish people, all the Israelites are in fact servants of God. Asher hotzeti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. Lo yimachru mimkeret eved. They should never be sold outright as a slave. So this is interesting, right? So there's a principle here that we were slaves to Pharaoh, and when God removed us and took us out and redeemed us from that slavery, we automatically had that relationship with God. So he says, Ki avadaihem, for they, this is Rashi, for they are my servants. And again, the Sifra, shtarai kodem, or shtari kodem, meaning his claim, right? A shtar actually is a contract. Kodem precedes. In other words, I have the first right on them. So you don't have a right to treat them as slaves because they are my slaves. They are my servants. Lo yimkaru memkeret eved. They should not be sold outright as a slave. And of course, we know that the difference is that when we work for someone and we're not a slave, it's our time and our labor that in fact we are selling, and not our bodies, not ourselves. So, behachraza kan yesh eved limkor. And what he means by that is that there is an announcement. Here, there is a slave to sell. In other words, again, to hold up this person in public and say, here he is to sell. And of course, again, if we're talking specifically about the court, that they have that right under these circumstances to sell that individual, that in fact they need to do it in a way that doesn't publicly humiliate them. V'lo ya'midenu al eved halekach, and they shouldn't stand this person up on the stone. This is the like a place in which they can display him, right? In other words, when they sold a slave, they used to hold them up. I think they even did this in the United States when they were selling slaves, to put the person on display that he's being sold as a slave for public auction, that kind of idea. You don't do that to people. Let's go on. Lo tirdeh bo befarach. You should not rule him rigorously. You should not make him serve with rigor. V'yareta me'elohecha. This has to be what's found. You shall fear your God. And we know, of course, that there's significance to ending a mitzvah with those words. Lo tirdeh bo befarech. You shall not treat him, rule over him with rigor. Melacha shelo letzorech. What do we mean by that? And what it is has to do with work that really isn't necessary. In other words, it's ultimately there's a level of humiliation there when you ask somebody to do a job that really isn't necessary, and they know that, and you know that, and it's just, in other words, just to make this person feel that they have to do what you're telling, that you're bossing it over them, right? So it says work melacha, work shalol tzorech, that isn't really necessary, kedei la'anoto. In other words, simply to make him feel that you are in charge. Al tomar lo, don't say to him, hachem li et hakos, warm this cup of water or wine for me. They used to serve wine, I believe, it was very concentrated, so they used to dilute it and serve it hot, like a hot toddy. All right, so don't say to him, warm this drink up for me, v'hu eino tzarich. Okay, and you really don't need him to do that. Ador tachat hagefen, ho underneath the vine, ad she'avo, until I come. In other words, stay working, hoeing underneath the vine until I come there. No, let's see. Sorry. Ad she'avo, until I arrive. Shema tomar ein makir badavar. And he's saying, lest you argue, well, no one will know that I'm really doing this to him. You know, they're not going to know that I don't really need him to do these things. But im makir badavar im letzorach im lav, whether or not it's really needed. Omer ani lo shehu letzorach, and I'm going to say to him, oh yeah, I need you to do this. I really need this work. And again, this is telling us why it ends with I'm the Lord your God. The fact is, whether your intentions are actually something God understands, he knows your intentions, right? If he says these things, of course, except for God, are private. No one knows what you're thinking, what your intentions are. Okay, lachach ne'emar vayareta, and for this reason it says you shall fear, which is exactly what we had said before. We had this phrase before, and I've explained before that the notion of God-fearing means that even if no one else would know that you've done something wrong, that you were doing something that wasn't right, God does know. And to be God-fearing means to have that sense. Let's take one more verse. V'avdacha v'amatcha asher yulacha. So this is interesting, though. This is perhaps in some ways problematic. And your servants, or probably but your servants, v'amadcha, and your maidservants, asher yulach, that will be yours, me'et hagoyim, that are from the nations, asher svivotechem, which surround you, mehem tiknu eved v'ama. From them you can purchase man servants and maid servants. So we're going to see, and in fact, it goes on to the next verse and also talks about that. And this, of course, is one of those. This is example again of those passages that are in some ways problematic, and when it's has this idea that yes, you can treat fellow Jews, you're not allowed to treat them badly, but you can treat others like that. It's certainly, I know it rubs me the wrong way, but on the other hand, I feel that this is a challenge and to try to understand it. Okay, so right? So you can take slaves and maidservants im tomar. So this is that you shall have im tomar. Should you say im ken bame ashtamesh? If that is the case, what can I use? With what can I use? Ba'avadi eini moshel. That when you say that I don't have control over my own servants. Here you are telling me that I'm very limited as to how I'm to treat my servants. Besheva umot eini nochel. Look at this. I mean, after all, those 7 nations that I'm going into in the land of Canaan, I'm not inheriting them. Remember, that's again all these sorts of issues that arise because they had to disinherit the people who were actually native to the land of Canaan at the time. They had to drive them out, and they weren't allowed to use them as servants. That appears still to be the case in the text here. Shahare is hartani, because I have been warned, and this is Deuteronomy 20, lo tichye kol nishama. Wow, right? It says, you shall not allow to live any soul, ella mi yishmesheni. So who's there left who's going to be able to serve me? And in general, we tend, and in fact, the rabbis also, the whole idea of slavery was definitely something that the Torah appeared to want to get away from, this whole idea. And of course, here we are dealing with situations that appear to accept the notion of enslaving people. And one of the ways in which, I mean, obviously, this is a problem that scholars have had to deal with for quite a while. And I think one of the things that they tend to come up with, not to say that this is a satisfying solution, but to say, look, trying to wean people from practices and customs that they're so used to and that are part of their understanding. I'll give you an example. There was a long time when colonialism was accepted as a fair practice and as a legitimate practice. And it's only more recently, within the last 50 years or so, that, or more, perhaps a little more than that we recognize the evils of colonialism. So how do you wean people away? Just telling them to go cold turkey doesn't work. And so the Torah is trying to be pragmatic and is trying to work with people so that they can slowly change. And whether this kind of law that we're reading here is such an example. So that is one way in which to say that the Torah isn't telling us we need to do this. This is a mitzvah, but saying, under these circumstances, this is what you can do. And at the very least, you can't treat fellow Israelites this way. So I'm not saying that I'm totally satisfied, but it is, sadly, this was a common practice. So we know that this happened to Jews, to Israelites, and that this was general practice on the part of humanity at that time. And sadly, I suspect there's still people who believe that. So just so hard to deal with. So Me'et Hagoyim, from those nations, Hem Yulachal Avadim, they will be servants, slaves to you. Asher Svivotechem, which are around you, Velo Shebetoch Gvul Artzachem, but not those people that are within the boundaries of your land, because those were those 7 Canaanite nations we talked about. Sharei Bahem Amarti Lo Tichye, because amongst them I said, you shall not allow to live, Kol Neshama, any soul. Now, I again struggling with this particular notion. I believe that it was basically saying that if in fact the people there were willing to accept God and willing to take on the beliefs, etc., and want to band with the Israelites, who and if even if they were one of these nations, these Canaanite nations, they did not come under this particular law. And again, the whole idea, I think this really underscores the notion of how that there is such a need to be able to interpret what the Torah is saying and not just take it at face value. So with that, I am going to mark the place and see. right up there. And I'm going to stop the share here. So, Kathy, any reactions to this?
Yeah.
You're on the spot now,
I
right?
huh?
You're on
Sorry,
the spot now. There's no one else around.
that's okay. I just wonder why God instituted said it was okay to have slaves. I don't know why, what the purpose of that was. I mean, I see where it graduated into America. I get all that. I mean, I see that they justified it through the scripture. I get that. But and it was wrong. But why did he say that was allowable?
I know.
I
I
don't
know.
understand.
Right. And Kathy, I don't know that I can really answer that question well for you. Um, the whole notion of service and to see service as being honorable. And also, we always know there has to be some system of people who are empowered and others who have to be followers. You can't have everyone as a chief, all right? And the issue is to what degree you owe your loyalty and your service, etc. So that the best I can do in trying to come up and deal with this very complex and difficult issue is to try to help us understand that serving is a great thing. And I
Yeah.
think there are other cultures that understand this as well. And however, in America, it's not such a strong sense that to serve others is actually the very basis of dignity and purpose.
Well, I
So,
don't know about that, but I know that beating your slave and asking them to do things that you would never do
mhm,
is
mhm.
just goes against any principle I've ever been
I
taught.
I'm with you there. I'm not trying necessarily to justify. I'm really trying more to understand it, and to understand your question. I consider your question a legitimate question. And in general, I even in these passages that we're reading about, we're not talking about beating someone. I mean, look at how slaves were treated in this country at one point, right?
Right.
I'm not saying that flogging is not allowed. Flogging is allowed. It's part of
Right.
the way a court can, in fact, enforce laws. Again, this is like a subject of a PhD, or of a whole issue. You look at what's going on in this country and people, with people going in and shooting up children, et cetera, and you have to ask yourself, how does one control these kinds of things? How do you prevent, in some ways, worse things from happening?
There's many kinds of slavery. I mean,
Mhm.
be a
Yeah.
slave to your guns.
Well, there we go. When you're right. But again, how do you unfortunately there are people who need to be forced to to behave decently.
Right.
And what do you use as methods of enforcement to make sure that people are behaving in a civilized kind of way? And I mean that's the question that would arise in terms of trying to respond, to the issue that you're raising. I mean, we have to deal, you know, there's so much to life and to understanding, and every day we're alive to try and understand a little bit more.
Right.
We're just scratching the surface here. We're only looking at the Rashi. We haven't, there's so much that's actually said about these subjects, okay? And there may be some material, who knows, maybe we can eventually, look at it that might help us understand this better, you know. So, all right, I am going to stop the recording.